In this project video, we're going to be building out a tooltip, and I know you're probably thinking tooltips are kind of boring. I mean, I could build a tooltip with CSS. And yes, you're correct that basic tooltips can be built with CSS and are really boring in JavaScript, but we're going to be building a bit of a more advanced tooltip that is going to dynamically position itself based on where the element is, so that way it's always on the screen. It's just going to have a lot of edge cases that we have to worry about, which is going to make this a really interesting project. So on the right hand side, I have two versions here. I have the downloadable files that you can get. This is just the raw HTML that we start with. And then this second tab is going to be the actual final version of the project. So if you want to get the starting HTML files, they're in the description down below. It's just really basic HTML. But essentially, what you can do with this basic version is move the tooltip around with the arrow keys. The left arrow keys and right arrow keys move it sideways, and the up and down arrow keys move it up and down. And that's just in this script.js file here. That's just so that we can easily position the tooltip in all the corners to check all of our edge cases. Now in this working example, right now I've configured the tooltip so that it's going to appear on the left-hand side, and if it can't appear there, it's going to appear on the right-hand side, and if it can't appear there, it's going to go top, and then it's going to go bottom. So if we hover this, you're going to see it appears on the top, and that's because there's not enough room on the left for the tooltip to appear. But if I move the tooltip to the right and hover, you can now see the tooltip is on the left-hand side. If I go to the right side of my page, or I'm sorry, the left, and I hover it, you can see the tooltip appears on the right because it goes left, then right, then top, then bottom. I can also come to the top, and you can see it doesn't have room to fit on the left, right, or top, so it shows up on the bottom. And then finally, all the way down here, obviously it's going to show up on top. So now that we understand a little bit of how this final product works, let me just close out of this, expand our page a little bit so we can see our starting code. Essentially, all we have is a very basic span inside of a div, and this span has a data tooltip property, which gives us the text for our tooltip. That's really all we need to know to work on this project. Then we have the script.js file, like I mentioned, which allows us to use the arrow keys to move this tooltip to all the different corners, sides, and center of our page, again, purely for testing purposes. Also, you may notice I don't have my webcam on in this video. That's just because since the tooltip is going to be in the bottom right-hand corner all the time, I don't want to have to constantly move my webcam out of the way. So in order to get started with this, I think this is a great project to use pseudocode in order to figure out what to build, just because there's a lot of logical steps and edge cases you need to worry about. So starting with the most broad version of what we need to do, and then slowly working towards making a more and more refined version that covers all of our edge cases is a great place to start. So I don't want to do any of this code in this script.js file though, because this is like our application code. I want to use this as if it was a tooltip library. So this code is something that once I write it, I can move it to any project that I want, and I'm never going to have to touch it again. That is what I want for this tooltip. So I'm just going to create a tooltip.js file, and essentially this is going to be our library. So now inside of this tooltip.js file, I really want to think about the use case of this tooltip, like kind of what is the most basic way that this tooltip works. And essentially the way it works is we have our mouse. As soon as we hover over something that has a tooltip applied to it, then it should show the tooltip. And by default, we're just going to show the tooltip on top because that's kind of the most basic version of a tooltip. We're going to work towards making it more configurable and dynamic later. But generally, when I'm working on a complex problem with lots of edge cases, I like to get the most basic, easy version of the project completed first, just so I have a base of code that I know works. And then I start building in the edge cases and making it work for all these unique scenarios. This is really useful so that I know that I have code that works before trying to build out all of the complexity all at once, because then if you make a small mistake in your code, you don't know if it's a problem with your edge case or a problem with your code. So you really had to figure that out, which is why I like to do the most basic version of my code first. So I just want to kind of write this out in comments to say exactly what's going to happen. So we're going to hover over a tooltip, then show tooltip over the top of the element. And then when mouse moves off the element, remove the tooltip. That's simple. It's really not that difficult. So the very first thing that we can work on is just setting up the event listener for when we hover over a tooltip. And since I want to make this dynamic, so if an element gets added after the page loads, we're going to be doing a global event listener like we've done in a lot of other projects. Also, I want to use parcel for this because I'm going to import this tooltip file into script.js. So let's just come in here and we're going to set this up as a npm project, npm init-y. And then all we need to do is install the parcel bundler. So we'll just say npm i --save dev parcel bundler. and this is going to take a while to install, so I'm going to come back to you when this is done. That just finished running, so now we can come into our package.json, we can set up our scripts. We're going to have our start script, which is just going to run parcel index.html, because we just have an index.html file, and then we're going to have a build, and this build is simply going to be parcel build index.html, super straightforward. Also, we can just run parcel by saying npm start down here, and we should be able to open up that new web page right here, localhost 1234, and there we go, we can close out of this live server version. Also, I want to just get our .git ignore set up, that way we can ignore node modules, we can ignore our dist and our cache. That way we don't have to worry about any of these files being committed into Git or GitHub whenever we do these changes. Okay, with all that out of the way, we can finally work on writing our code. And like I said, the first thing I want to do is that global event listener. I'm just going to make a utils folder where we can add that too. So if I just expand this here so I can actually click this button, we can create a utils folder. And inside of here, we're going to create a file called add global event listener.js. And this is something we've done in quite a few of the other videos inside of this course. So you're probably very familiar with it, but we can just export default function called add global event listener. And this is going to take in a type, a selector, oops, make sure I spell selector correct, and of course a callback. And then all we need to do inside of here is say document, we're going to add an event listener for that type. And of course, it's going to have a callback. And in the callback, we just want to check to see if we're matching that selector. So we can say if the target matches our selector, then we can just call our callback with that E parameter passed to it. That's all we need to do for our add global event listener. So let's go down into our tooltip and import that in. So we can just come up here and say import add global event listener from, and we just need it from /utils, whoops, utils, I cannot spell, utils, there we go, /add global event listener. And now down here, for our hover over a tooltip, we can just say add global event listener. This is going to be for mouse over. This event essentially fires every time we hover over an element. All we need to do is make sure we select our data tooltip data attribute, because if we go to our index file, you can see all of our tooltips have a data attribute called data tooltip, which contains our tooltip text. Then finally, we can use our callback inside of here, and this is going to be where we can show our tooltip or do whatever we need to do. For now, I'm just going to console.log here just so we can see if this is working. And to make sure we have this tooltip file, I'm just going to import it up here in the top of our script.js. And something interesting is you'll notice right now we don't have any exports from this. So what we can do is just import the file directly. We can say /tooltip, and this is going to import the file, which is going to run all of the code inside of here, just like when you import a normal file. We're just not exporting anything because all of our code is global and runs right away. So now if we save this and we come over here and just inspect our page, we should see in the console we have text being printed out whenever we hover over our event. So if we hover this element, you'll see we get the text. And it doesn't matter how much we move our mouse, it only shows up once until we unhover and then rehover, it shows it again, which is exactly what you want for a tooltip. So back into our tooltip, we've pretty much completed this hover over tooltip step. We can delete that for now. The next thing we have to do is show the tooltip. And I just want to show the tooltip first before I even make it hover over the element, because that's actually a fairly complex task. I just want to create a tooltip. Let me just come down here and create a function for creating a tooltip. I generally like to split these kinds of things into function. So we'll create tooltip element, and it's just going to take the text that we're going to put inside of the tooltip. Then in here, we need to create our element. So we can say tooltip is equal to document.create element. That's going to be a div. And then I have a class already defined in our CSS called .tooltip. If I just scroll down here to find it, you can see we have .tooltip. So we're just going to apply that to our tooltip for all of our tooltip styles. So we can say tooltip.classlist.add tooltip, just like that. And then finally, we can just take our tooltip, we can set the inner text equal to our text, and we can return the tooltip we just created. So now up here, we can create a tooltip. We can say const tooltip is equal to create tooltip element, and we can pass it in our text, which right now is on our data attribute. So we can say that we want to get our e.target.dataset.tooltip. That is going to be the text for our tooltip. Then what we can do is just append this to our body to have it show up on the page. So we can say document.body.append, and we're going to append that tooltip. Let's see if this actually does anything. If we save and hover over this element, you're going to notice that if I scroll my page down, you can see the tooltip is down here because we're appending it to the bottom of the body. And right now it's just getting thrown to the very bottom of our page. And we can hover over and it's going to append a bunch of different tooltips. If I inspect this, you're going to notice that there are tons of tooltips because we're never actually removing the tooltip when we remove our mouse. So let's do that next because that's actually way easier than positioning the tooltip. So we've got the show the tooltip part. So we can kind of delete that. Next step is going to be over the top of the element. But what we're going to focus on is when we move the mouse off the element, removing the tooltip because that's fairly easy to do. So we can just say e.target.add event listener. And this is going to be for when we leave. So mouse leave. We want to run some code. And all we want to do inside of here is take our tooltip and we just want to remove it so we don't have it anymore. And an important thing to note is we only want to run this event listener once because we only need to remove the tooltip once. Because once we re-hover the tooltip, we're going to re-add the event listener. So we only want this to happen once. So now you can see when I hover the element, you see the scroll bar appear on the side of our screen. And that's because our tooltip is being appended to the bottom of our body. And when I unhover, that tooltip or that scroll bar goes away. It's kind of hard for me to show you by scrolling down because once I scroll, it's going to move my mouse off of this element. But you can see that the tooltip is being appended to the bottom and then removed. So the next step is going to be positioning the tooltip in the proper location. And I've actually done a little bit of work for you to try to make this as easy as possible. Inside of our styles.css, I have this tooltip container, which is essentially a fixed rectangle that covers the entire width, height, and everything of the screen. So we just need to create an element for this tooltip container and add it to our body, and it's going to cover our entire screen. And that's exactly what we need for positioning our tooltip inside of it. So inside of here, all we need to do is add that tooltip container. And I just want to do this once right at the very beginning. So I can just come all the way up here and create my tooltip container. This will just be const tooltip container. And this is just going to be a simple div. So we're going to create an element, which is a div. And then we just want to take our tooltip container. We want to add that class we just looked at, which is called tooltip container. And then finally, we just need to add this down to the body. So we can say document.body.append tooltip container. Now, instead of appending our tooltip here to the body, we're just going to append it to that tooltip container. And if I inspect the page now, we should see that we have this tooltip container. And when I hover it, you notice the entire page turns blue because it covers the entirety of our page. And it doesn't matter how tall or wide or skinny our page is, how far it scrolls, this is always going to cover 100% of the screen, which is perfect for positioning our tooltip. And now you can see when we hover, our tooltip appears in that top section of our page. And that's just because it has a top and left of 0 inside of this parent, which is exactly what we want. And I can show that. We come down here, you can see we have our tooltip, position absolute, and we're not defining the position at all with top left, bottom, or right, which means it's going to default to that top left corner for now. So now the next step that we need to do for our tooltip is going to be positioning it. That's the only thing we have left out of this pseudocode, and we just want to position it over the top of the element. And for now, we're just going to essentially put this over the top of the element. It doesn't matter if it's going to go off the page or not. We don't care. We just want to put it over the top of our element right in the dead center. That's going to be our goal. So I'm just going to create a simple function called position tooltip. And it's going to take in the tooltip as well as the element that we want to position this tooltip over. So inside of here, what we can do is we can just say position tooltip. We're going to take our tooltip and our e.target, which is the element that we're trying to position it over. And for now, we're not doing anything, which is fine. So inside of here, what we need to do is we need to get the essentially location of this element. And we can use a function called getBoundingClientRect, which is just going to give us the dimensions and position of any element. So we can say const rect is equal to element.getBoundingClientRect. And we can pass in the element here. And now if we just console.log this rect so we can see what we're working with, you can see exactly what this is going to be rendering. So hover over this, and of course we get an error, getBoundingClientRect is not right because I spelled React. Now if I save this, re-inspect our page, and hover, you should see here, we now have a bottom position, a height, a left, right, top, width, X, and Y. Essentially all we really care about is going to be the top left as well as the width and height, because that'll allow us to position this element on the very top of the element and as well as center this on the element. So what we need to do is get the top of the element. That's where we want the bottom of our tooltip to show up, is at the very top of this element. So essentially what we can do for this is say that we want the top of our tooltip to be at this location right here at the top of our element, plus the height of the tooltip to move it upwards. So we need to get the rect of our tooltip as well. So we can say const tooltip rect. We're going to rename this to element rect, just so we can distinguish between them. And our tooltip rect is going to be essentially the exact same thing as this, but for our tooltip. So tooltip here, we don't even need to pass anything to this. I don't know why I did that. There we go. So now if we save, we have our tooltip dimensions and we have our element dimensions. And let's just log out our tooltip dimension here real quick. We can get tooltip rect. And if I inspect our page here, come over to the console and just hover this, you can see I spelled the console wrong. So I'm sorry, it should be console.log. Now if I inspect this, come over to the console, hover this, you can see something really interesting. Our tooltip is at 0.000000000. That doesn't exactly seem correct, and you are correct. This is very, very wrong. Now the reason for this is actually very simple. If we go all the way up here, you'll notice we're positioning our tooltip before we add our tooltip to the page, which means when we try to get the bounding client rect of our tooltip, it's not even on the page, so it doesn't have any dimensions yet. What we need to do is first add our tooltip to the page, and then we need to position our tooltip. And that may sound counterintuitive. You may think that the tooltip is going to like flash up here in the corner and then move to the right location, but because of the way the event loop works in JavaScript, it's going to render out all of this code first, which means it's going to add it to the page and position it before it actually makes changes to the HTML, so you won't have any weird flashing problems. But what this will allow us to do is actually get the dimensions of our tooltip, because now if we save this and we inspect our page over here, go to our console and hover, you're going to notice that our X and Y and top and left are all 0, 0 because it's way up here in the top corner. Our right is 200, our width is 200, and you also see our bottom and our height. So now we have accurate dimensions describing our exact tooltip. So now the next step is, like I said, to get the top of this element and the height of our tooltip, and we need to offset our tooltip's top by that amount. So we can say that our tooltip.style.top, which we know needs to be set in pixels, is going to be equal to here some string interpolation. So we're going to try to get some value and add pixels to the end of it. So we want to get the element rect.top. What this is going to do is give us the top of our element here. And if all we did was this and save, when I hover, you're going to notice the very top of our tooltip is at the top of our element. But we want the bottom of our tooltip to be at the top of the element. So we also need to come in here and we need to subtract out our tooltip's height. So we can say tooltip rect.height. And now if we hover this, you're going to notice the bottom of our tooltip is right at the top of our element, which is exactly what we want. Now all that's left is to make it so that we center it over this element. To do this, let's just take our tooltip. We need to style the left-hand side this time. We're going to do a very similar thing to what we did with our top. And we need to come in here and we want to get the center essentially of our tooltip. The center of our element, I'm sorry. Easy way to do that, get the left-hand side, and then you want to add half the width. So we can say element rect.left plus the element rect.width divided by 2. This is going to essentially give us the dead center of this. So if we save this and we hover, you now see that the left is over the dead center, but we want this to be over the top of our element right in the center of our tooltip. So all we need to do is just subtract half the width of our tooltip. So we can say tooltip rect.width divided by 2. Now, if we hover over here, you're going to see the dead center of our tooltip shows up right above the element, which is exactly what we want. But you're going to notice a little bit of a problem when we move to the left side of our screen and hover. Obviously, it expands past the edge of the screen. And if we move to the right-hand side of our screen, you can see that it starts to wrap and it looks really ugly, and that's definitely not what we want. So clearly all of our edge cases are not working. As you can see, it's pretty much not working unless we have plenty of room on the top, left, and right of our tooltip. So there are a couple different ways that we could determine if our tooltip is outside of our element or not, essentially if it goes off the page or wraps weirdly. The first way would be if we wanted to use a lot of math, we could determine based on math before we even render the element if it's going to show up outside of our screen. And this is not too difficult, but it's a lot of math and it's really not that enjoyable to go through a bunch of math. So instead, we're going to go with the second option. And this second option is essentially to render the tooltip and then just determine if it's outside of the place that it's supposed to be. So we just render the tooltip and then check, is the tooltip outside of where it should be? If so, then clearly it doesn't belong and we need to move it somewhere else. And we just repeat that until we find a place where we can actually put the tooltip. An easy way to do this is just to take our tooltip container and determine if the tooltip bounds are within that container. So I'm going to create a new function. And we're just going to call this is out of bounds. And all this is going to do is take the element we want to check, which in our case is going to be our tooltip. We'll just name it element. And then all we need to do inside of here is take our tooltip container as well as our element and determine if they are within one another. So we can get the rect of our element, which is just element.get bounding client rect. And we need to get our container rect, which is just our tooltip container.get bounding client rect. And the reason that we can do this is because our tooltip container, like I said, is all of our screen. It covers our entire screen. So if the element is at any point outside of our tooltip container, then it's also outside of our screen. Now what we need to do is just determine if our left, right, top, and bottom are outside of the screen. And to do this, I'm going to return an object which has a left, a right, a top, and a bottom property. And it'll be true if it's out of bounds and false if it's in bounds. So we can check this just by seeing if the left side of our rectangle is less than our container rect.left. Pretty straightforward. If our tooltip is farther left than our container, then we're out of bounds. Same thing with our right. If our rect.right is greater than our container rect.right, then we're out of bounds. Top is just going to be rect.top is less than our container rect.top. And then finally, our bottom is rect.bottom is greater than container rect.bottom. This will give us true or false depending on if our element is out of bounds. Now up here, let's just console log the result of running this. We can say console log is out of bounds for our tooltip. And since we're already changing our top and left, it'll be able to do the calculations based on our new position. So let's just come over here, inspect our page. We're going to hover and see exactly what this is printing. If we come over here, hover, we get all these being false. Left, right, top, bottom, all false because we're in bounds. We go to the left side of our screen and hover. You're going to notice left returns true because the left side is out of bounds. If we go to the top and hover, we're going to notice our left and our top return true because it's out of bounds. We go to the right side and hover, you're going to notice here that our right is true and our top is true because it's out of bounds on the top, and it's right on the edge of being out of bounds for the right, which is enough to return true in our case. So we have essentially determined if our element is in bounds or if it is out of bounds. And all I want to do with that information is if we are out of bounds, I just want to essentially say, hey, you know what, our tooltip can't go here. So what we need to do is put our tooltip in a new position. So let's just set this to a variable. We're going to say const bounds is equal to is out of bounds. And then since this is a top tooltip that we're currently positioning, we just want to say if our bounds.top is true, then that means we're out of bounds on the top, and we just need to reset our tooltip and try to put it somewhere else. And that is going to be for another function, another case. We're not going to really focus on that right now. So we're just going to reset our tooltip's position, and I'm just going to create a function for this. And the reason we're doing this resetting of the tooltip position is so that way, when we go to another way of positioning our tooltip, we start out with a neutral tooltip that doesn't already have positions applied to it. So we can say function reset tooltip position takes in a tooltip, and all it's going to do is take the style for our top, left, right, and bottom, and it's going to set it to initial. So we can just copy this down. We have left, we have right, and we have bottom, just like that. So we're going to be positioning our tooltip to be initial, which is just going to default it back to its normal position. So now, if we just come over here and hover, this is fine. If we go to the top where it doesn't actually fit and hover, it's going to go back to its initial position, which is in the top left corner. For now, this is fine because we're not working on positioning our element below or above or to the left or to the right. Right now, we're just doing top only, and then if it doesn't fit, we're just defaulting to this initial position. But what do we do in the case where our tooltip is right up here on the left side of our screen? It's expanding past the left. What we need to do in this case is shift our tooltip to the right until the left side of our tooltip is right on the edge of the border of our screen. That's actually fairly straightforward to do. We can just come in here and check to see if we are out of bounds on the right or the left side. So we can say if bounds.left, we want to do something, and if the bounds.right, then we want to do something. And in our case, we actually want to make sure that we check the right-hand side first and then check the left-hand side. And the reason for this is that we need to specify our right to be 0 pixels away from the edge if it's expanded past the right, and then we can set the left-hand side. And this is because if we just zoom our screen down so it's really small, and that way if we're here, we zoom in really big, you notice our tooltip is sandwiched between both sides of our screen. What we need to do in this instance is actually make sure that our tooltip shows up within these bounds and it doesn't expand off of one side or the other side. So we need to check our right side first. Let me just zoom this back to a normal zoom level and move our bounds right check up here first. And if we are on the right side of our screen, like let's imagine we're in this scenario right here, what we need to do is instead of setting the left side of our tooltip, we need to set the right side. So we can say tooltip.style.right is just going to be equal to 0 for now. We just want it to be right on the edge of our screen. And our tooltip.style.left, this is going to be equal to initial. We just want to reset it back to normal. Now if we save and we go to the right side of our screen and hover, you're going to notice we're still getting a little bit of a weird issue. In order to figure out what this issue is, let's just log out our bounds. So we can say console log bounds because it looks like it's not actually making it into this section of our code. So inspect our page, go to the console, move it to the right and hover, and you're going to notice we get right as false. And the reason this is showing up as false is because if I scroll down here, we're only returning true if our right is outside of the bounds. But if it's right on the edge of the bounds, we're returning false. I want to say if it's right on the edge or outside to return true for all of these. That way, when our right edge is touching over here, it'll still return true. Now, if we move it to the right and hover, you're going to immediately know this is working because our tooltip is now showing in the correct position. And if we inspect, go to our console, you can see our right side is returning true, saying it's passing the bounds, or it's right on the bounds in our case. So it's saying that now our right side should be 0, which right anchors our tooltip, and then our left is initial, which just means our left can be as wide as it needs to be. Lastly, inside of if our bounds are on the left, we just need to make sure, that would be this scenario here where it's over the edge, we need to make sure our left is essentially at 0. So let's just copy what we did here and change this to our left. Now you can see this works on the left side and the right side. But what happens if we zoom in super far and we hover like this? We want our tooltip to be just like this, where the left and the right are both 0. And if we hover this and just inspect our page real quick, look at our console, look at these objects, you can see both left and right are returning true. And in that case, what's happening is our right is being set to 0 and our left is being set to 0, which means it's just a full width element, which is going to touch both ends of our screen. But you're probably thinking, 0 is not really the best thing to use. We want a little bit of spacing, right? Like right now our tooltip is just touching everything that's super close. We want to space our tooltip out a little bit. And that is going to be the next thing that we work on before we work on moving our tooltip to the bottom or the left or the right and so on. So in order to work on this spacing, we could come up here and, we could define a default spacing. We could just say const spacing is equal to like 5 pixels or something. But what I want to do is I want to allow the actual person using our library to determine the spacing themselves. And to do that, I just want them to be coming in here and say data spacing and set it to something like 5 or 10. They could say, I want the spacing to be 5. And now the tooltip should be 5 pixels away from the left side of the screen, the right side of the screen, the top, the bottom, as well as the element itself. So how are we going to go about doing this? We have to actually change quite a bit of our code to make this work. So inside of our tooltip, let's just look at our code and kind of see what would be changing. The first thing that we need to do is get the spacing of our tooltip. So if we just come to where we're actually positioning our tooltip, we have our element. So we can get the spacing, which is just going to be our element.dataset.spacing. This is going to be the spacing we defined in our index.html. But if we don't define a spacing, I want to have some kind of default fallback spacing. So at the very top of our file, we're going to define a default spacing, and we're just going to set this to 5. We want our default to be 5 pixels. And then in here, I'm going to define something like 10 so we can really see if this is working or not. So now let me just scroll down a little ways to where we have our spacing, and I need to parse this into an integer because right now it's a string and I want this to be an integer so I can do comparisons with it. But if we don't pass any spacing, we're just going to use our default spacing of 5. Now that we have our spacing, what we can do is use that to determine where our tooltip needs to go. We can determine that we need our tooltip to be 5 pixels away from our element. So we can just come in here and subtract our spacing, which is going to be 5 pixels, or in our case, 10 pixels since we defined it. So now let's just check this to see if it works. Let's get rid of this here. What I want to do is just hover, and you'll notice immediately we're 10 pixels spaced away from our element. And if we change this to something like 30, so we can really see it, and we hover, you're going to notice now we're even further away. But if we don't define a spacing and we save, you'll still notice we have 5 pixels of space away from our element. You can see when I zoom in, we can see that little bit of difference between the tooltip and the element, when before we didn't actually have that difference. So let me just put that spacing back in. We're going to use 10 in our scenario. And now what we need to do is if we're on the left side of our screen, we want to be spaced 10 pixels away from the left now. So down here where we're setting our left to 0, instead set it to our spacing. We need to convert this to pixels. So spacing as pixels. Now, when we go to the left side of our screen and hover, it's 10 pixels away from the left side of our screen. Also, what we need to do up here is the same thing for right. Instead of using 0, we need to use 10 pixels. And you may think that's all we need to do because it looks like this is working, but there's actually a little bit of a problem. If I just expand our page a little bit, we may eventually get to the point where I can see this, or actually if I shrink it down a little bit, and we'll just zoom to make this a little bit easier. I'm trying to get to the exact point where this makes sense. Not quite there, not quite there. Let's see here if I can get it. I think it'll become more apparent if I just increase this to like 50, so we have a really large spacing. You'll notice that the spacing between our element and our tooltip is 50 pixels, but the spacing between the left and the right side of our screens is less than 50 pixels. And that is because inside of our tooltip code, if we scroll down to is out of bounds, we're just checking to see if it's out of bounds from our container. We're not taking into account the spacing. So we need to, in our is out of bounds, take into account our spacing and see if the left side of our tooltip is within the container, but also if it's within the spacing that we've defined. So to do this, we just need to append our spacing onto the end of our left side. We need to subtract it from our right side. We need to add it to the top, and we need to subtract it from the bottom. Now, if we hover, you're going to notice this still isn't working. And the reason for that is I never actually passed spacing into the is out of bounds function up here. So let's make sure we pass spacing in. And now when we hover, you're going to notice we get that same 50 pixels on the left, bottom, and the right side of our tooltip, which is exactly what we want. Now let's move that back down to 10, which is a much more reasonable number for a tooltip. And you can see this is working as you would expect. And I'll just zoom this back out to a normal zoom level, which looks good. So right now at this point, we've actually covered the majority of what it takes to render out a tooltip, especially a basic tooltip that shows up on the top. But of course, we're not taking into account these edge cases where we're overflowing the top of our element. So we need to work on those next in order to figure out how we can render our tooltip in other positions. And the best thing we can do is determine what order we want to render our tooltip in. In our case, I think top, bottom, left, right makes the most sense because most tooltips show up on the top. And if they can't, they'll show up on the bottom. And if for some reason they can't show up on the top or bottom, then they're going to go to the left and to the right. So I just want to come in here and I want to define a position order. And this position order is just going to be an array that has top, bottom, left, and right. These are our positions in order. And then what we need to do is be able to map these positions to actual code that we can run. If we just come back down here, we have our position tooltip function. And I want to change this up a little bit to be only for positioning the top of our tooltip. So I want to take all the top specific code down here out and into its own function. So all of this code, which is for the top, get rid of it. And we're going to run a new function called position tooltip top. This is going to take in our tooltip. It's going to take in our element, and it's going to take in our spacing. Also, instead of passing our element in here, we're going to pass our element rect. And our tooltip rect, we're just going to define inside of our position tooltip top. So now we can just call position tooltip top, pass it in our tooltip, our element rect, and our spacing, and hopefully everything will work as before. And like I said, when I ever refactor code, I like to make sure I check to see if my code works before I start adding new functionality. So what's coming here? This works, this side works, and of course our top section is still broken, but that was broken before. So no worries. So we've successfully refactored this position tooltip top function out, and we can create another function for tooltip bottom, for example. So all I want to do is if we successfully render our tooltip, I want to return true. So all the way down here, I'm going to return true if everything was successful. But if we expand out of our bounds on the top, I want to return false because that means that we aren't able to actually render our tooltip properly. So I'll return false. And here I can just say if position tooltip top was successful, then, we're done, we can return. Otherwise, I want to position our tooltip on the bottom, for example, which is going to take in our tooltip, our element rect, and our spacing. And to do this, I'm just going to copy this entire position tooltip top function and change it to the bottom. And now we need to think about how we position our tooltip on the bottom. And the way that this essentially is going to work is we want the top of our tooltip to show up at the bottom of our element. So here, instead of doing all this fancy code with subtracting the height, we can just say we want to get our element rect.bottom. So the bottom position, and we want to add in our spacing this time to make it a little bit further away. Our left is still going to be exactly the same because we don't need to worry about the left side changing. It's always going to be the same, whether it's top or bottom. So that code is fine. We're still checking our bounds correctly. But here we want to see, are we outside of the bottom of our element? If so, reset our tooltip, and all of this other code stays exactly the same because it works the same for left, right, on top and bottom. So now, let's hover here. This works. We move to the left, it works. Move to the right, it works. Down here, everything works as expected. And now when we move to the top, you can see our tooltip is rendering on the bottom of our screen. And it's working exactly as we would expect. And that's because all of this code for left and right, we've already done once. We don't have to change it. It works the same. All we did is just move our tooltip to a new location on the bottom of the element and then check to see if we were outside of the bounds on the bottom. And then if we are, then we're going to do something returning false in our case. In our example, since we're always doing top first, we're never actually having a case where we're outside of the bounds on the bottom, but it's good to still have there in case we decide to do bottom first. One issue you'll notice though is that this is very, very hard coded. It would be much better if we could use this array up here and just loop through this and run the code instead of hard coding the order into our code. So what I want to do is I want to create a map that maps these strings to a function. So we can just say position to function map. And all this is going to do is we're just going to take top, and it's going to be position tooltip top. And we can have bottom, which is position tooltip bottom. Our left is going to be position tooltip left. And our right is going to be position tooltip on the right. So this may look a little bit confusing at first because we're taking functions and we're putting them in an object like this. Essentially, all we're doing is we're taking a string top and we're saying top is associated with the function position tooltip top. So now when we access position to function map.top, we are essentially getting that function position tooltip top, and we could call it like this and pass all the information to it. That's exactly the same as if we just called the function directly. That's all this map does. But what it means we can do is loop through this array and run this every single time we have something out of bounds. So if our top is out of bounds, then we run bottom, bottom's out of bounds, we run left, and so on until we get to the end. So now, if I come down here where we position our tooltip, instead of hard coding this, we want to just loop through all of our positions. Now you may think I could just do, position to function dot for each, but I actually want to exit out prematurely if we have a successful tooltip render. So instead, I'm just going to do a normal for loop actually. So I'm just going to say let I equal 0. I'm going to say that I is less than our length of our positions. Whoops, length. If I can spell correctly. There we go. And we want to add 1 each time. And again, like I said, the reason I'm doing this inside of a normal for loop is that we can just call return, and that'll return out of this position tooltip function completely, while with a for each, we can't return out of position tooltip. We'd have to run through every single one, which we don't want to do, because if we render it correctly the first time, there's no point in trying to re-render the tooltip other places. That would break everything. So now all we need to do is let's get our function. We're just going to call it func, and we're going to set it to our position to function map. And what we need to do is actually change this from position to function map to positions. We want to loop through our positions, not our mapping of them. And we want to get a specific position, which comes from that positions array at the ith index. So this right here is just the index of the element that we're currently in. So it would be top for the first one, then it's going to be bottom, then left, then right. And then we're just calling our position to function map and getting the thing. So for top, it would give us this position tooltip top function. For bottom, it would give us position tooltip bottom. So we're getting the function associated with the direction, and then we just need to call that function. So we can say func tooltip rect spacing. And if this is true, then we return. So now we can get rid of all this code down here, and hopefully if we did everything correctly, and make sure I pass an element rect here, if I did everything correctly, this should still work just like before. And of course, when I'm hovering, you'll notice nothing's actually working, so clearly we have an error somewhere. Let's look at our console. It says uncaught reference error position tooltip left is not defined. That makes sense. Up here, we define these functions, position tooltip left and right, but we don't actually have those functions. Also, this is called position order. Down here I used positions. Let me make sure I just put position order in there. So what we want to do for now is we're going to make some dummy functions for position tooltip left, which takes a tooltip, element, rect, and spacing. And we're going to do the exact same thing for the right-hand side. These are just dummy functions for now, just so our code compiles. Now you can see our tooltip works on the top. It works on the left, works on the right, up here, shows up on the bottom as we would expect. And down here, it works in all these scenarios as well. So our tooltip is working just like it was before. And that's just because we're looping through all of our positions. If our tooltip renders correctly and we return true, that's it. We don't do anything else. If it returns false though, and cannot render, we move to the next position in this position order array, in our case bottom. And if that's correct, then we exit out. If it's not, we continue on further and further. So now before we go about defining these position tooltip left and position tooltip right, I want to think about this as a library. And in a library, you may want your tooltips to show up on the bottom first. Maybe you want them to show up on the left first. The user probably decides where they want the tooltip to show up. So I want them to be able to determine, for example, data positions, and I want them to pass in the positions they want and the order they want them to go in. So for example, let's say that they want it to go left, and then they want it to go right. So we'll do like a little pipe symbol right, and then it would just default, if left and right don't work, it'll default to our normal ordering of top, bottom, left, and right. So let's say that a user using our application wants these positions to be first. So it's going to go left first, then right first, otherwise fall back to our positions. Let's write the code to actually do this. So inside of our tooltip, up here where we're positioning it, we need to get the positions the user wants. We're going to call them the preferred positions. And these are just going to be equal to our element.data set.positions, positions, and I cannot spell correctly at all. There we go. So we're getting our positions, and if we don't have any positions, default this to an empty string. And the reason for that is what I want to do is I want to take that string and split it on this character here, the pipe symbol. That way we can get all of their positions in order. So then I just want to call the split method, which allows us to split an array, split a string on a character, and it'll turn it into an array. So what this does is it'll split on the pipe symbol and give us an array where the first element is left, and this second element is right inside of our array. So we can just see that by console logging preferred positions. Now, if I inspect, go to the console, hover this, we get left and right. And if I don't pass anything here at all, and I go to tooltip, inspect, hover, you notice we get an empty string in our array, so just an empty array. And if we go over and we pass in something without a pipe, for example, we just want left to be first, and we come over to our tooltip, make sure we inspect this, you can see it's just an array with left inside of it. So I just want to move this back to that left-right example that we had before. And now what I want to do down inside of here is I want to combine the preferred positions with our positions. So we can get a new variable called positions, which is just going to be equal our preferred positions, and we're going to add on to them our position order. Essentially, we're just taking their positions and putting them at the front of our array, and then we can loop through these positions down here, and it's going to start with their positions first and then move on to our positions next. So now if we hover this, it's going to be starting with left and then moving on to right and then top, then bottom, then left again, and then right again. Technically that's not ideal, but it's not really a big deal to have it do the extra check for left and right, so we're just going to leave it in. It's a lot more work to get rid of it, and it really doesn't save any performance at all. There is one edge case we need to think about here though, and that is what if they type in a function that doesn't exist? So let's say they typed in lefty. We don't have any lefty position, so when we hover, you're going to notice it doesn't actually work. We get broken code, and when we inspect, go to our console, uncaught type error, func is not a function. That's because our mapping, we're trying to get a function, but we don't have a key up here for lefty, so it's returning to us undefined, and we're trying to call a function on undefined. Clearly that doesn't work. So we can just say if func exists, so func, and we can call a function on it. That just means that we actually have a mapping for this. Now, if we have that issue, everything still works. It's just going to ignore the input that the user puts in. So now we can move on to actually writing out our left and right tooltip position, because right now we're just always positioning on the top, even if we have room on the left-hand side. So what I want to do, I'm just going to copy all the code we have in here for our top. I'm going to put it into our left. And the reason for this is that our code is actually very similar. We're going to be modifying the top and left position, But the way that we're modifying these is going to be a little bit flipped, if that makes sense. Our left is now going to follow the same logic as top because we're putting it on the left side of our tooltip. So what we want to do for our left, just remove all of this code for now. We want to take our element, rectangle, and we want to get the left-hand side of it, if I spell element correctly, and we just need to offset it because we want to set our left side of our tooltip to that, and that would mean that our left side of our tooltip is at the left here. We just need to move it to the left one whole width of the tooltip, so we can just subtract our tooltip rect.width, and we also need to subtract the spacing. And you'll notice if we look at the original way we set the top for top of our tooltip and the way we're setting our left here, it's very similar. We're just replacing top with left and height with width. Now we're going to set our top, and again, it's going to be very similar to what we did up here. So I can just copy this. We're going to paste this into our top section. And instead of being based on our left, we want this to be based on our top because we want to center this vertically here in our tooltip. So it's going to be centered for our element. So we have our element erect.top. So then what we need to do is instead of adding half the width, we're going to add half the height. And then we're going to subtract half the height of our tooltip to offset it back down into the dead center. Then here, if our bounds are exceeded on the left-hand side, reset our tooltip. And here, instead of checking our right and left, we need to check our top and we need to check our bottom. But we need to make sure we check bottom first and top second. And inside here with our bottom, if we're over on our bottom, we just want our bottom to have our spacing and our top to be reset to initial. And down here, if we're over on the top, we set our top to have our spacing. We're really just swapping everything around so that instead of being vertical, so top, bottom, we're doing this horizontal left and right. Now if we save, you're going to notice our tooltip appears on the top because there's no room on the left or the right. Move it over here. It shows up on the left because there's room on the left, which is great. Down here, it shows up on the left. Up here, it shows up on the left. But if we move to the right, it's still not showing up on the right because we haven't implemented that function yet. So again, what we're going to do, copy all the code inside of here, come inside of our position tooltip right. We just need to essentially do the exact same thing. We need to position our top and our right, and our top isn't changing. That's just for centering. And here, what we just need to do is get the right side of our element. Don't need to worry about spacing, or I'm sorry, our tooltip width, and we can just add our spacing onto the end of it. Then down here, we want to check to see if we exceed the right-hand side. That's it. Now, if we come over here, you're going to notice we get a bit of an error. It's trying to show up on the left-hand side. And the reason for this is because in our tooltip right, we are setting the right side here. This should be setting the left to the right-hand side of the tooltip. That'll put it on the right side. Now we can hover. You can see it shows up on the top. Come over here, it shows up on the left because that's available. And then here, it's going to go left and then right. So hopefully we'll see that it shows up on the right-hand side. So now, no matter where we are positioned, our tooltip is always going to have an area where it's going to show. And it's going to be able to be set by the user what the default position is. In our case, left first, then right if there is room. If not, then it's going to go back to the default positionings of top and bottom, and then left and then right. Now that pretty much sums up everything there is about creating this tooltip, but there's a few ways that you can expand upon this project if you want to take it to the next level. So the first thing that you can do, which is by far the easier of the two, is to enable other positions. So right now we have left, right, top, and bottom. But what if you wanted the tooltip to appear in the corner? For example, the top left, or maybe the bottom right. So this is 4 new positions. You got top left, bottom left, and bottom right that you want to be able to add into the tooltip, as well as making sure that these are default positions as well up here in our position order. So just adding in all of those additional places the tooltip can appear is a great first step to improving this tooltip. The next step is going to be a little bit more involved, and that would be to actually make it so the tooltip has an arrow on it. So you'll notice right now, there's no arrow on our tooltip, it's just kind of hovering there. And that's because positioning the arrow is a little bit complex to say the least. And I didn't really want to bog down with all the CSS involved with it as well. But essentially for this additional task, if the tooltip's normal like this, you want to put the arrow dead center in the tooltip, just like the tooltip is dead center above the element. But if, for example, over here, you can see, if we just get rid of these data positions, let's do top as our default. Over here, you'll see that the tooltip is appearing on the top. And if we put the arrow in the center of our tooltip, it's no longer going to appear in the correct place. It's going to show up somewhere over here. So we want the arrow to appear in the center of the element here, but still on the tooltip. Same thing here on the right-hand side. We want this arrow to be in the center of our element, which will be on the right-hand side of our tooltip. And depending on if you have positions top, top left, top right, all of that is going to really determine where your arrow's position is going to be. It's a fairly involved task, but if you're able to master that, then you've definitely mastered this tooltip project.